The countryside was supposed to be peaceful rolling farmland where honest families grew crops and raised animals for generations. But when he started working the fields adjacent to the Morrison property, he discovered that some farmers were cultivating products that had nothing to do with feeding America. Welcome to Silent Heroes. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden dangers in America's heartland, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. Daniel Rodriguez had been working seasonal farm labor across Iowa's agricultural counties for 12 years, moving from farm to farm as harvests demanded extra hands and equipment operators who could handle the demanding physical work that kept America's food supply flowing from field to table. At 49, Daniel looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a reliable migrant worker who'd found steady employment in agricultural communities that valued hard work over questions about workers' backgrounds. He was skilled with farm machinery, experienced with crop rotation systems, and most importantly, he kept to himself and never caused problems for the farming families who employed him. Daniel's reputation had spread throughout the rural counties surrounding Cedar Rapids. Farm owners knew they could trust him with expensive equipment, rely on him to work unsupervised in remote fields, and count on him to respect the privacy that farming families valued in communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. The agricultural work was exactly what Daniel needed after decades of stress and violence. Operating tractors across endless acres of corn and soybeans, maintaining irrigation systems that brought life to crops, and working harvest seasons where community cooperation determined whether families would prosper or struggle through difficult winters. But Daniel Rodriguez wasn't just a farm worker. He was former Special Agent Daniel Rodriguez, Drug Enforcement Administration, with 23 years of service in operations that had taken him from Mexican cartel investigations to domestic marijuana cultivation raids across rural America. He'd spent over 2 decades learning to identify illegal drug operations, infiltrate criminal organizations, and gather evidence that could dismantle networks that were poisoning American communities. Daniel's DEA career had ended with a medical discharge following a shooting incident during a raid on a cartel operation in Arizona that had left him with permanent injuries to his right shoulder and psychological trauma that made active law enforcement impossible. The incident had involved a rural drug lab that had been protected by corrupt local officials, resulting in the deaths of 2 federal agents and Daniel's decision to disappear from federal attention while finding work that wouldn't trigger the hypervigilance that made normal employment unbearable. The raid had gone wrong when local law enforcement provided advance warning to the cartel, allowing armed guards to prepare an ambush that killed agents Sarah Martinez and Kevin Thompson while Daniel barely escaped with his life. The betrayal by officials who were supposed to protect their communities had destroyed Daniel's faith in traditional law enforcement and convinced him that the drug war was creating more corruption than it was preventing. Farm work had been perfect therapy for someone who'd spent 23 years fighting a drug war that seemed to create more problems than it solved. The transition from hunting drug dealers to growing legitimate crops had provided exactly the kind of healing that traditional counseling couldn't achieve. Instead of destroying lives through arrests and prosecutions, Daniel was helping feed communities through honest agricultural labor. For 12 years, Daniel had deliberately avoided noticing anything that might compromise his peaceful retirement or his employer's trust. He developed selective blindness to the kind of details that would have been valuable intelligence during his DEA years: unusual activity patterns, suspicious equipment, and the kind of operational security that suggested people were hiding something from law enforcement attention. Daniel had learned to see only soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop health indicators that helped him be a better farm worker. He trained himself to ignore everything else that might remind him of the violent world he'd left behind. Morning conversations with farmers about commodity prices and weather forecasts, afternoon work maintaining equipment and repairing irrigation systems, evening meals with agricultural families who treated him like extended family rather than hired labor. But this spring was different. This spring, Daniel was working adjacent fields for 3 neighboring farms, and his agricultural expertise was revealing details that 23 years of drug enforcement training made impossible to ignore. The Morrison farm, which Daniel had been hired to help with corn planting, was located next to agricultural operations that appeared completely normal from public roads but displayed characteristics that triggered every alarm system that had been trained into Daniel during his DEA career. The neighboring Blackwood property had irrigation systems that were too sophisticated for the crops they claimed to be growing, security measures that were excessive for legitimate agricultural operations, and activity patterns that suggested 24-hour operations rather than seasonal farming schedules that governed normal agricultural work. Most concerning, the soil conditions and crop spacing on the Blackwood property indicated cultivation techniques that were specifically designed for marijuana production rather than the soybeans and corn that were listed on agricultural reports filed with county agencies and state agricultural departments. Daniel realized that he was working directly adjacent to what appeared to be one of the largest illegal drug cultivation operations he'd ever encountered during his DEA career. A sophisticated marijuana growing facility that was using legitimate farming operations as cover while producing drugs that would be distributed to communities across the Midwest. The operation displayed professional-level organization that indicated cartel involvement rather than small-scale local production. Greenhouse facilities that were designed for climate-controlled cultivation, irrigation systems that could support industrial-level production, and security infrastructure that included motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and perimeter monitoring that belonged in military installations rather than family farms. Daniel continued his normal work routine while his professional assessment capabilities automatically analyzed what he was observing. The Blackwood operation had invested millions of dollars in equipment and infrastructure that could only be justified by production levels that would supply drug markets across multiple states. During his lunch break, Daniel positioned himself where he could observe the Blackwood property without attracting attention from security systems or personnel who might be monitoring neighboring farms. Through binoculars that he claimed to use for checking distant irrigation equipment, Daniel documented details that confirmed his worst suspicions about the scope of the criminal operation. The facility included processing buildings where raw marijuana would be prepared for distribution, storage warehouses that could accommodate finished products awaiting transport, and vehicle access routes that connected to county highways through paths that avoided main roads where law enforcement might conduct routine patrols. Most significantly, Daniel observed personnel whose behavior and equipment indicated military or law enforcement training. These weren't casual drug dealers or opportunistic farmers who had decided to supplement agricultural income with illegal crops. These were professional criminals who had established a major distribution hub in America's agricultural heartland. Daniel's agricultural work provided perfect cover for gathering intelligence on an operation that federal agencies had probably been trying to locate for years. His legitimate presence in adjacent fields allowed him to observe activity patterns, document personnel and vehicle movements, and assess security measures without triggering the kind of suspicion that would alert the criminal organization to surveillance activities. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel's observations revealed the complete operational structure of what appeared to be a cartel-connected marijuana cultivation and distribution network. Morning deliveries of supplies and equipment that indicated large-scale production, afternoon processing activities that suggested industrial-level operations, and evening transport operations that moved finished products to distribution networks across the region. The facility was operating with professional efficiency that indicated organization, resources, and protection that extended far beyond local criminal networks. Daniel recognized the operational patterns from his DEA years. This was cartel infrastructure that was probably connected to Mexican criminal organizations that had established permanent operations in American agricultural communities. But Daniel also realized that his proximity to the operation was creating personal danger that could result in the same kind of violence that had ended his DEA career. Criminal organizations that invested millions in drug production facilities wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operations, and Daniel's agricultural expertise might have revealed details that could compromise their security. The Blackwood operation included armed security personnel who conducted regular patrols of the perimeter areas where Daniel was working. These weren't casual guards, they were professionals who displayed the kind of tactical awareness that indicated military or law enforcement backgrounds, probably former soldiers or corrupt police officers who were providing security for cartel operations. Daniel faced a decision that would determine whether he spent his remaining years working peaceful farmland or returned to the world of drug enforcement that he tried to leave behind permanently. He could ignore what he'd observed, complete his seasonal work contract, and pretend he'd never seen evidence of crimes that were destroying the same communities he was trying to help feed. Or he could do what Special Agent Rodriguez would have done, gather comprehensive intelligence on the drug operation, identify the criminal network involved, and build a case that would expose dealers who were using America's farmland to poison America's children with drugs that were being produced in facilities that should have been growing food for American families. Daniel made his choice when he observed a transport operation that confirmed the Blackwood facility was distributing drugs to markets that included schools and communities where children were becoming addicted to products that were being grown just miles from their family farms. That evening, Daniel activated communication protocols he hadn't used since his medical discharge, reaching out to former DEA colleagues who had transitioned to task force positions targeting rural drug operations. His agricultural access to the Blackwood facility provided intelligence gathering opportunities that traditional law enforcement surveillance couldn't achieve without alerting the criminal organization to investigation activities. Rodriguez, this is Agent Williams, DEA Rural Operations. We've been tracking increased marijuana distribution in your area but haven't been able to identify production sources. What's your assessment of the Blackwood property? Daniel provided detailed intelligence on facility layout, security measures, production capabilities, and operational patterns that he documented during 2 weeks of agricultural work in adjacent fields. His DEA training allowed him to estimate production volumes, identify distribution schedules, and assess criminal organization structure based on operational characteristics that would be invisible to casual observation. Williams, this isn't small-scale local production. Infrastructure indicates cartel-level investment and professional security. Production capacity suggests supply operations for multi-state distribution networks. The DEA response was immediate and concerning. The Blackwood operation was part of a larger criminal network that federal agencies had been investigating for over 3 years, but previous infiltration attempts had been compromised by leaks from within local law enforcement agencies. Daniel realized that his accidental discovery might be the breakthrough that federal investigators needed, an inside source who could gather evidence without alerting the corruption network that was protecting the drug operation from traditional law enforcement investigation. Over the following month, Daniel became an unwitting undercover operative while maintaining his cover as a seasonal farm worker. His agricultural expertise provided legitimate reasons to work in fields adjacent to the criminal facility while documenting intelligence that federal agents couldn't gather through conventional surveillance methods. Daniel's observations revealed details that exposed the complete operational structure of a cartel network that was using Iowa farmland to establish permanent drug production and distribution infrastructure, processing schedules that indicated industrial-level production, transport operations that moved finished products to markets across the Midwest, and financial operations that involved legitimate agricultural businesses as money laundering fronts. The criminal organization had achieved what law enforcement considered the most dangerous development in rural drug enforcement: permanent cartel infrastructure in American agricultural communities that provided perfect cover for operations that were destroying communities while appearing to be legitimate farming activities. But Daniel's intelligence-gathering activities were beginning to attract attention from security personnel who weren't typical farm workers. During his 3rd week of observation, Daniel noticed surveillance activities that indicated the criminal organization was conducting background checks on all individuals who had regular access to areas adjacent to their facility. Daniel knew that professional background investigation would eventually reveal discrepancies in his cover identity that might lead to questions about his actual history. If the criminal network discovered his DEA background, they would realize that their operations had been compromised and might accelerate drug transport or eliminate witnesses to protect their investment. The situation escalated when Daniel observed a meeting between Blackwood facility personnel and individuals who were clearly local law enforcement officials. County sheriff deputies and state agricultural inspectors were receiving payments from criminal organization leadership while providing intelligence on any official investigations that might threaten drug operations. Daniel realized that the corruption network included officials who were supposed to protect agricultural communities from exactly the kind of criminal infiltration that was destroying families through drug addiction. The same sheriff deputies who investigated drug crimes were being paid to protect drug production facilities from law enforcement investigation. Daniel activated his emergency communication protocols and contacted his DEA liaisons with intelligence that would require immediate federal intervention. Williams' corruption network includes local law enforcement and state officials. Criminal organization has protection from county sheriff and agricultural inspection services. Traditional investigation approaches will be compromised before operations can be executed. The federal response was immediate, understood, Rodriguez. Federal task forces are being positioned for coordinated operations. You'll need to maintain cover for 96 hours while we finalize arrest warrants and coordinate with federal prosecutors. Daniel realized that the next 4 days would determine whether his month-long undercover operation resulted in the dismantling of a major cartel network and the rescue of agricultural communities from criminal infiltration, or whether the criminal organization would discover his identity and eliminate him before federal agents could act on his intelligence. 96 hours later, Daniel received what he knew would be his final work assignment adjacent to the Blackwood facility. The criminal organization was accelerating their operational schedule, moving to harvest and transport their entire crop before seasonal agricultural activities would bring additional workers to neighboring farms where their operations might be observed by people who weren't part of their security network. But Daniel's month of intelligence gathering had also attracted the attention of security personnel who were conducting systematic background investigations of everyone who had regular access to areas where drug operations might be observed. Daniel understood that his cover identity was probably being scrutinized by people who had extensive experience identifying law enforcement personnel attempting infiltration operations. As Daniel arrived for his morning work assignment, he was approached by 2 men who introduced themselves as agricultural consultants but carried themselves with the kind of tactical awareness that belonged to people with military or law enforcement backgrounds who had transitioned to criminal activities. "Mr. Rodriguez," the taller man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we're conducting a survey of agricultural workers in the area to ensure that everyone is properly documented for seasonal employment requirements." Daniel understood that this wasn't an immigration check, it was either a recruitment attempt or a threat assessment to determine whether he posed a security risk to criminal operations. Either way, the conversation would determine whether he completed his federal cooperation safely or became another casualty in rural drug enforcement operations. "I've been working these farms for 12 years, Daniel replied, maintaining his agricultural worker persona while calculating tactical options that hadn't been necessary during legitimate farm work. "All my documentation is current with the Morrison family." The men escorted Daniel to an equipment shed where additional personnel were waiting. Individuals who clearly weren't agricultural workers but displayed the kind of operational security awareness that indicated extensive experience with violence and intimidation tactics used to protect criminal organizations from law enforcement investigation. Daniel, the lead investigator, said, consulting paperwork that contained far more information about Daniel's background than should have been available through normal employment verification. "We've been impressed by your work ethic and discretion during your time in this agricultural community." Daniel realized that the criminal organization had conducted professional background investigation that might have revealed inconsistencies in his cover identity. If they'd discovered his DEA history, this conversation would end with his execution and the compromise of federal operations that were scheduled to begin within hours. "Discretion is important in agricultural work," Daniel replied. "Farming families value privacy. Privacy is essential in our line of work," the investigator continued. "Especially when that work involves agricultural activities that require protection from government interference in legitimate farming operations." Daniel understood that he was being offered a choice: join the criminal organization or be eliminated as a security threat. It was the same recruitment approach that cartels used with corrupt officials: provide an opportunity to profit from criminal activities or face consequences for refusing to cooperate with operations that were generating millions in drug proceeds. "What kind of agricultural activities?" Daniel asked, playing the role of someone who was interested in learning more about lucrative opportunities that were available to workers who could be trusted with sensitive information. "We operate specialized crop production facilities that require workers who understand the importance of operational security," the investigator explained. "Agricultural techniques that government agencies might misunderstand if they became aware of our methods." Daniel realized that he was being recruited to work directly in marijuana cultivation operations where his agricultural expertise would be valuable for maximizing production efficiency. The criminal organization was offering him employment in facilities where he would have access to complete operational intelligence that could expose their entire network structure. But accepting the offer would require Daniel to participate in criminal activities that were destroying the same communities he'd spent his DEA career trying to protect. Refusing the offer would probably result in his execution and the loss of intelligence that could save those communities from continued cartel infiltration. The conversation ended when Daniel requested time to consider their offer while completing his current work obligations with the Morrison family. The criminal organization agreed to a 72-hour deadline for his decision, but Daniel understood that he had perhaps 12 hours before they decided he was too dangerous to leave alive. That afternoon, federal task forces executed coordinated operations across 3 counties, targeting drug production facilities, distribution networks, and corruption networks that had been protecting cartel operations from law enforcement investigation. Daniel's intelligence had provided the evidence that federal prosecutors needed to obtain warrants for the largest rural drug operation in Iowa's history. At exactly 4:47 a.m., while Daniel was completing his final intelligence gathering assignment adjacent to the Blackwood facility, federal tactical teams executed simultaneous raids on drug production facilities, processing centers, and distribution networks across central Iowa. Daniel's month of agricultural surveillance had provided the breakthrough that dismantled a cartel operation that had been poisoning Midwest communities for over 5 years. The Blackwood facility was revealed to be one of the largest marijuana cultivation operations ever discovered in American agricultural areas, a sophisticated production complex that was generating over $50 million annually in drug proceeds while using legitimate farming operations as cover for criminal activities. Federal agents discovered processing equipment capable of producing thousands of pounds of finished marijuana products monthly, distribution networks that supplied drug markets in 12 states, and financial operations that laundered criminal proceeds through legitimate agricultural businesses and county government contracts. But the real intelligence value was in the corruption network that Daniel's observations had exposed. County sheriff deputies, state agricultural inspectors, and federal agency personnel who had been providing protection for criminal operations while sabotaging law enforcement investigations that threatened cartel infrastructure. The arrests included Sheriff William Blackwood, whose family farm had been providing cover for cartel operations while he used his law enforcement authority to protect criminal activities from investigation. Agricultural Inspector Sarah Morrison, who had been falsifying crop reports to conceal marijuana cultivation while providing advance warning of official inspections. And DEA Agent Michael Chen, who had been leaking federal investigation intelligence to criminal organizations while ensuring that rural drug operations remained undetected by honest law enforcement personnel. Daniel's evidence had exposed a corruption network that reached into local, state, and federal agencies while protecting criminal operations that were destroying agricultural communities through drug addiction and violence. The same officials who were supposed to protect farming families were being paid to facilitate criminal activities that were turning rural Iowa into cartel territory. 3 months later, Daniel stood in a federal courthouse in Des Moines, testifying in proceedings that would result in life sentences for drug trafficking, conspiracy, and corruption charges that included racketeering violations under federal organized crime statutes. His agricultural expertise had provided evidence that federal prosecutors described as the most comprehensive documentation of rural cartel operations in American law enforcement history. But Daniel's testimony was protected through witness security protocols that concealed his identity from remaining cartel networks that might seek retaliation against the person who had exposed their Iowa operations. His cover as a seasonal farm worker would be maintained while federal agents used his intelligence to identify and dismantle similar criminal networks operating in agricultural communities across the Midwest. After the trials concluded, Daniel received an offer from the Department of Agriculture to join a specialized unit that used agricultural workers, inspectors, and other farming professionals to investigate criminal organizations that were infiltrating rural communities while using legitimate agricultural operations as cover for drug production and distribution activities. Your experience demonstrates that people in agricultural professions have unique access to rural areas where traditional law enforcement can't operate effectively without alerting criminal organizations to investigation activities, the federal coordinator explained. We want to create a program that uses those capabilities to identify and expose cartel operations before they can establish permanent infrastructure in American farming communities. Daniel accepted the position, understanding that his accidental discovery while working adjacent fields had led to the most important work of his career. Some criminal networks hid behind the most trusted institutions in American society, and some evil disguised itself as legitimate agricultural activities that were supposed to feed families rather than destroy them through drug addiction. The cartel network that had infiltrated Iowa's agricultural communities was completely destroyed, but Daniel knew that similar operations were probably being established in other farming areas where criminal organizations could use rural isolation and agricultural cover to avoid law enforcement detection. His new position would allow him to use his farming expertise and DEA training to identify those operations before they could poison additional communities with drugs that were being produced on American farmland that should have been growing food for American families. 12 years after trying to disappear from drug enforcement, Daniel had discovered that his most important mission was protecting agricultural communities from criminal infiltration that threatened everything honest farming families had built over generations of legitimate agricultural work. The children who lived in rural communities that had been targeted by cartel operations would grow up in environments that were protected from drug addiction and violence. But they would also benefit from knowing that their safety had been ensured by someone who understood that some battles require people to return to fights they thought they'd left behind permanently. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone whose ordinary work concealed extraordinary capabilities? Someone who chose to confront evil when they could have ignored it? Share their story in the comments, because quiet heroes like Daniel deserve to be remembered. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Silent Heroes. We're here to honor the people who serve without recognition, who understand that real heroism happens when someone chooses to protect communities instead of just working in them. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the person working in fields next to yours has spent decades learning to recognize dangers that threaten the communities that agriculture is supposed to protect. And sometimes that recognition saves entire regions from criminal infiltration that could destroy generations of honest farming families.